A few weeks ago, I made a video on the roller coasters that disappointed me the most. Well, as promised in that video, I also made a list of the top coasters that positively surprised me in one way or another. This list will specifically look at coasters that ended up being better than what I expected them to be, and not just coasters that I liked the most. So for example, you wouldn't see something like Fury 325 on here, because while it is a top 5 coaster for me, I pretty much expected that to be the case before riding it. Anyway, let's get into it. These are the top 10 roller coasters that positively surprised me. Before getting into the top 10, let's give a few honorable mentions. Full Throttle at Six Flags Magic Mountain is one of those coasters that I had no expectations for because it seemed relatively insignificant in the stacked lineup at Magic Mountain, but I ended up really enjoying what it had to offer and have it ranked third in the park. Laugh Track at Hershey Park is just a spinning family coaster, but I had way more fun on it than I was expecting, especially sitting to face backwards for the first couple of drops. It had fun theming and a pleasant ride experience. And finally, I heard awful things about the Manhattan Express in Las Vegas, but I ended up really enjoying the ride I got on it. To be fair, I never experienced it with the old trains, but the coaster runs pretty well with its new trains and wasn't uncomfortable for me at all. It's not a top 50 coaster or anything, but it was much better than what I expected it to be. Alright, now let's move on to the top 10. Starting off our list is Batwing at Six Flags America. If you watched my video about coasters that disappointed me, you saw that I included the other Vekoma Flying Dutchman, Nighthawk, on it. I had liked Batwing when I rode it as a kid, but my most recent ride on Nighthawk had me very worried for getting back on Batwing. Luckily, it ended up being far smoother than Nighthawk, and I really enjoyed it as much, if not more, than I did when I was younger. It felt a lot different than the B&M Flyers did, with the elements it throws at you, and I would even say I prefer the restraints on this to the B&M ones. The vertical loop on your back was especially unique and thrilling. I got super lucky to ride this one last time, just a couple of weeks before it closed, so I was surprised how good it was, and it ended up even being in my top 50 overall. Number 9 is Grizzly at King's Dominion. I made my first visit to King's Dominion in March of 2024 and had heard that Grizzly was one of the roughest wooden coasters out there. I actually hadn't seen anything about the retrack before going in and was very surprised when it ended up being a very smooth wooden coaster. Like seriously, I had no clue that they had refurbished the ride at all. And on top of that, the track reprofiling made for some very good forces and airtime moments throughout the ride. Going in expecting a painful and awful ride experience and coming out thinking it's one of the better wooden coasters that I've ridden is a great feeling and absolutely warrants a spot on this list. Number 8 is X-Flight at Six Flags Great America. I've never been the biggest fan of wing coasters because the forces are never that great and they're usually not very well paced. X-Flight doesn't have the height of Gatekeeper or the launch of Thunderbird, but for some reason it just felt like it was much better paced than any of the wing coasters I've ridden. It went through its inversions well and had a couple of the best near-miss moments that I've ever experienced during its finale. And for those reasons, I currently have it ranked as the highest of all my wing coasters when I thought it would be the worst of them, so it lands a spot on this list because of that. At number 7, I've got Tennessee Tornado at Dollywood. Even before I was a big coaster enthusiast, I was well aware of how uncomfortable most aero coasters are. So naturally, I was expecting more of the same when I rode this, and to be honest, it ended up being a lot of what I expected the first few times. But then, a few years after my first rides, I went back to Dollywood and gave it another shot, and it was absolutely astounding. I found it to be way smoother than every other aero coaster all of a sudden, and no longer an uncomfortable ride. The first drop into the tunnel was one of the best first drops I've experienced and is followed up by 3 very forceful inversions that always make me gray or even black out. Unfortunately, it is a short ride, but what it does have is amazing and it allows it to hold a spot in my top 50 coasters. Number 6 is Candemonium at Hershey Park. Everything I'd seen before my recent visit to Hershey had said that Candemonium is one of the weakest B&M hypers out there. That, plus it being in a stacked Hershey Park coaster lineup, did not bode well for it. However, once I got a few rides on it, all of that was laid to rest, and it ended up being one of my favorite B&M hypers, even ranked over rides like Mako and Diamondback. The airtime hills were well profiled throughout the entire layout. The airtime hill after the first drop specifically was one of the best sustained floater moments on any coaster that I've ridden. The trim brake is indeed a buzzkill, but it's placed so close to the end of the coaster that it doesn't really affect the ride at all in my opinion. And it just ended up being overall way better than I expected it to be as a coaster. Number 5 is Superman Krypton Coaster at Six Flags Fiesta Texas. The only thing on my mind when I went to Fiesta Texas in 2020 was finally riding my first RMC and didn't really do much research on anything but Wonder Woman and Iron Rattler leading up to my trip. And after getting a few rides on this B&M floorless coaster, I was absolutely amazed by it. It was extremely smooth with forceful and whippy inversions that had a great element of interacting with the quarry wall on multiple occasions. I shockingly ended up ranking it number 2 in the park over Wonder Woman. To this day, it remains in my overall top 25. I admittedly haven't been back to the park since 2020, so hopefully it'll be just as good when I do get back there eventually. At number 4 is actually another Six Flags Fiesta Texas coaster in Goliath, now known as Chupacabra. I know this seems like a weird pick, but let me explain. Up until this trip, I hated B&M inverts for the most part and would always bang my head around and come off of them with a headache. I especially didn't like Batman at Six Flags Over Georgia at the time, which was the only other Batman clone I'd ridden then. So I got on Goliath expecting to dislike it, but ended up getting a very smooth, fun, and comfortable ride on it, which I really liked. It's even featured in an old Top 25 Coasters video I made a few years ago. This was the first time I actually liked a B&M invert, and since then I've grown to be much more fond of them as a whole. Number 3 is Mindblower at Fun Spot Kissimmee. The first and only rides I've gotten on this coaster are back in 2017, not long after it opened. My family kind of just decided to visit this park on a whim, and I had no idea there was even a coaster there at all, as this was before I became a real enthusiast. And after getting like 10 rides on it, I thought it was insane and didn't think it was possible for a random wooden coaster at a Fun Spot of all places to be as good as this was. It's a layout packed with airtime and of course that awesome looking corkscrew in the middle. To this day, it's still a top 50 coaster for me, and I hope I can get back on it sometime soon. Taking the second place spot is Wrath of Rakshasa at Six Flags Great America. I made my first visit to Great America this year, and of course, this is the park's newest coaster. I've always considered myself a certified dive coaster hater because they just never seem to do anything interesting outside of the first drop and end up being boring rides in my opinion. With that being said, I had like no expectations for this coaster and ended up coming off of it very impressed. For one, I thought it was very smooth no matter where I sat, but most importantly, the pacing and elements were all great and made up for a far better ride experience than any other dive coaster I've been on. I also want to mention that the operations were absolutely top notch and I was waiting like 20 minutes when the posted wait time was 45 because the queue was moving so fast. This is a top 50 coaster, actually just one spot below Mindblower for me, and this is my second favorite coaster at the park. And finally, at number 1 is Maverick at Cedar Point. When I made my first trip to Cedar Point back in 2018, I liked roller coasters but was far from being an enthusiast. My family had heard about Cedar Point from a travel TV show we were watching a few years prior and finally decided to take a trip up there for my birthday in 2018. The only coasters I knew anything about were Top Thrill Dragster, Millennium Force, and Magnum XL 200 at the time. In fact, I was so out of the loop that I chose to skip Steel Vengeance having no clue what it was or how good it was supposed to be because the line was that long. At the time, I only cared about doing the big coasters, so the amount of shock I felt when I rode this little 100-foot tall roller coaster was insane. It was so intense and had great launches and airtime and just made for a next level ride experience. It ended up being my favorite coaster in the park aside from Dragster, and even today is still in my top 10 overall coasters. I literally went from not knowing that Maverick even existed to having it as my number 2 overall coaster at one point in time. And for that reason, it is easily the most surprising coaster that I have ever ridden. And with that, this video comes to a close. What coasters out there have wowed you? Leave a comment and let me know. Make sure to subscribe if you want to see more content like this. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time.